He had every skyline on the map and every room in every continent. Yet some nights, Julian Carrington stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse and listened only to the absence. The city below glittered with other people's dinners and other people's laughter. Up here, behind glass and service doors, his home answered with echoes. Money made his life efficient and private. It did not teach him how to be small. The storm arrived like a reminder. Rain so hard, it blurred the neon and made the marble steps of his estate shine like a river. The estate at the edge of town, once a working property, now a private retreat for a man who rarely left his offices, had a gate that closed on everything but the wind. That night the gate creaked and someone rang the intercom. Security, more out of habit than expectation, alerted the housekeeper. Margaret answered the intercom with a voice that had managed boardrooms and family meals with the same practicality. "We have someone here," she told the security head, and then, when she saw the small figure huddled by the stone lion, she didn't call the police first. She called Julian. He came down because he couldn't sleep, because the sound of human presence in the storm felt like an intrusion that deserved his attention. He found, pressed against the ironwork, a child no older than 6 or 7, soaked to the skin, clinging to a threadbare rabbit with one button eye. Her hair was plastered to her face like a drowned bird, and her cheeks were raw from the cold. She looked up at him as the rain slid from his coat, and her eyes, set in a face still furred with childhood, were not pleading so much as observing, tallies of a life even that small. He could have ordered her removed. He could have signaled security to bring her to the municipal shelter across town and returned to his quiet. Instead, he heard Margaret before he understood why. "Please," she said, low and irrevocable. "We keep her warm. There are small rituals that decide a life." Margaret wrapped the girl in towels. Julian made a coffee for himself and a cup of warm milk for the child, and when she accepted it with a shy, unbelieving gratitude, Julian felt a pull he hadn't had language for. The house, which had been an exhibit of good taste and solitude, rearranged itself into an impromptu harbor. That first night, he learned the girl's name was Lena. She said it slowly, as if testing the syllables, and that she carried nothing but the rabbit and a small backpack with a folded, worn picture of a woman whose face was faint as a memory. For reasons he could not later fully name, Julian put the rabbit on the mantel and refused to let the girl go back into the rain. The media would call it a curiosity, a billionaire who took in an abandoned child. Neighbors would gossip about his eccentricities. Within the staff, opinions split between protective instincts and a fear of complicating an already complicated life. Margaret, who kept the household moving, who had watched marriages and mergers dissolve at table and loved ones leave through the door, stood as both guardian and conscience. She said once, when Julian paced the study late into a night of legal calls and logistics, "You can't shelter a child the same way you shelter investments. People are not assets to be diversified." Julian had not intended to be paternal. He had intended only to give a dry bed and a warm night, but the dry bed became a week and the warm night stretched into months. The state in which Lena was found, alone at the gate, a small name scrawled on a napkin tucked into the backpack, led to inquiries. Social workers visited the estate with the awkward naturalness of professionals who had learned to be firm in storms of human complexity. There were checklists and background checks and a cascade of paperwork that diminished no dignitary, but humbled everyone who attempted it. Julian listened, paid for legal help, and understood quickly that adoption did not belong to the realm of decisive purchases. It required presence. He surprised himself by showing up for medical exams and school placement meetings. He surprised himself by learning to tie shoelaces the way Lena liked, double loops, tight enough to withstand a child's impatience. Margaret kept the house from becoming a shrine to sudden good intentions. She kept food simple and relationships honest. She told him plainly, "Do not buy her silence with objects. Buy her trust with yourself." The first months were a series of micro-adjustments. A bedtime story in which Julian stumbled through the voices of characters but kept reading. Lena teaching him to make tea just so. Him confessing, once clumsy and private, that the estate used to be full of children's laughter and that he had mislaid the want to hear any of it again. There were nights when Lena woke from nightmares and the house's large rooms felt too cavernous for the small task of taking care of another person. There were mornings when she smuggled in small gifts, an acorn, a card drawn with shaky crayon, and placed them on his desk like offerings. The decision to adopt was not cinematic. There were hearings and waiting lists and the slow approvals of agencies who wanted to ensure the best for Lena. He arranged for guardianship and then for formal adoption in a compaction of legal time. Months summarized in a montage of signatures, of hearings, of a social worker who asked pointed questions about his intentions and received honest, imperfect answers. He was not absolved by money. He was judged by visits and references and the midnight vigils when Lena's fever broke and he sat until dawn with his hand on her small back, understanding what being a father implicated. When the adoption papers were final, they celebrated with lemon cake in the kitchen, while a thunderstorm rolled itself out somewhere beyond the hedgerows. Julian held the signed documents with fingers that might have been more used to contracts than to children's knees on his trousers. Lena made a paper crown and put it on him, ceremony replacing protocol, an authority the law could never have conferred. Because authority of the sort that holds families together is earned by days and repetitions, by scoldings followed by apologies, by the unglamorous attention to scraped knees. Years shaped them. There were montages, school concerts in a community hall, Lena blowing out candles, Julian missing the timing of the clap and laughing anyway, Margaret teaching Lena the recipe for a stew that came to mean home, Lena out in the greenhouse at the edge of the estate, palms in soil, hair tied back, measuring seedlings like a small scientist. The estate, which formerly served as a weekend retreat and a storeroom for company donor events, had a neglected greenhouse tucked behind the servants' wing, glass cracked, soil sour. Lena found it as she found most things, with stubborn curiosity. She began to coax life out of that soil in a way that made Julian watch from the doorway with something like wonder. She read books, later textbooks, then articles. She apprenticed herself to the head gardener and to a visiting agronomist, asking practical questions about composition and irrigation that surprised and pleased those who loved the land. The company Julian had built was vast and remote and capable of doing enormous good or enormous harm. It had charitable wings, endowments and corporate farms that supplied city markets. But size breeds complacency, and complacency breeds corners cut in service of efficiency. An old project, an irrigation program promised to a cluster of rural towns, was faltering. Crop yields were failing, and the philanthropic money earmarked for rebuilding wells and soil study was lost somewhere between boardrooms and construction bids. There were whispers of contamination, of mislabeled chemicals, of rushed contracts. One evening, a news story ran with images of parched fields and families with jars that once held clean water. The headline asked, too bluntly, if Julian's name should be associated with failure. When reports splashed across pages, Julian's instinct was to call lawyers and publicists. It was a reflex he had honed, opinion management. Lena watched the screen from the kitchen table, spoon frozen in air, and then asked the question directly that would be spoken in offices by directors much later. What did they do wrong? He was surprised by her bluntness. He was more surprised that he didn't have the immediate answers. He had left much of the operations to managers who reported in metrics and briefings. He had donated funds, approved large budgets, and called it philanthropy. Lena, who had grown into a young woman with an almost clinical curiosity, one that matched tenderness with method, saw in the headlines a problem that looked like a chance to do right. Margaret, who had always been the household's moral fulcrum, said nothing. She set 2 plates down and watched. "Let her try," she said to Julian, not because she believed he was incapable, but because she hated the world being reduced to press releases while people suffered. There were practical obstacles. The board resisted sending a junior staffer into a crisis that required PR-trained spokespeople. The local farmers had been burned before by pledges and now accepted visits with guarded courtesy. The social workers who once had to justify an adoption were now experts on trust, and they recommended a cautious, community-centered approach. Julian authorized a team, partly because he trusted Lena, and partly because he felt accountable in a way he had not when he gave money from a distance. At first, Lena's ideas met the usual resistance. Interns who thought she was romantic about soil, and seasoned managers who equated goodwill with inefficiency. But she did something the company had not seen in a long time. She listened. She climbed into pickup trucks to visit fields, knelt in dry earth and let farmers talk. She matched scientific curiosity with human humility. She proposed measures that were not flashy: water audits, soil reconditioning, transparent contracting. She insisted on independent testing. She sat in town halls and took notes. Most of all, she told stories of the crops as if they mattered not to shareholders, but to families. There were failures, because such work was messy. A pilot irrigation system they tried clogged and had to be disassembled. A shipment of seedlings rotted when storage conditions were misjudged. Each misstep came with cost and embarrassment. Lena owned them. She apologized in public and private, learned from agronomists and gardeners, and the women who had been tending fields for generations. She did not treat the people she worked with as beneficiaries, she treated them as partners. The turning point came when an independent lab confirmed that a supplier had mislabeled a compound used in the irrigation plan, an error intentionally concealed by a subcontractor to save costs. It was not the company's only sin, but it was an exposé that allowed clarity. When Julian announced the results in a town meeting, a sober, unvarnished recounting of how things had gone wrong, he did not begin with defenses. He began with an apology. Then he stepped aside and let Lena speak. She refused the prepared remarks he had had typed up in a box of corporate language. Instead, she told, in plain terms, what they had learned and what they would do. Fund independent testing, rebuild the wells with community oversight, retrain local contractors, establish an endowment for long-term soil health. She named the subcontractors deception, and when the board asked about legal recourse, she proposed oversight measures rather than revenge. It was the first time in many years Julian watched someone restore integrity to his work, without asking him to be the hero. The press watched, and then they watched again, because the story was not simply one of scandal averted. Lena's leadership had a particular shape, a combination of technical competence and refusal to let the people around her be invisible. The project became a model, not because it was slick, but because it rooted authority in those who cultivated the land. Journalists who previously mocked the billionaire's eccentricities found a story they could respect. Local farmers who had once been wary signed on to longer-term partnerships. The company redirected funds from performative donations to a sustainable endowment. Julian found himself removed from the center of applause and strangely lighter. One morning, years after the storm, in a small ceremony that gathered most of the staff and a handful of town residents, Julian spoke into a microphone with hands that did not tremble, but felt tender. He could have spoken about metrics and market share. Instead, he told a story about an iron gate and a storm, about a rabbit with a missing button eye, about Margaret's steadiness and the way a small hand had learned to fold a paper crown. He spoke of failure and of the lessons Lena's stubborn curiosity had taught him. He named publicly and gratefully that his life had been changed by legal obligation and countless imperfect acts of love. He said clearly and with a voice that had to be learned that legacy was not wealth held, but wealth shared. There was no triumphal music, no neat redemption. The antagonist, people who had cut corners and men who had tried to exploit the situation, faced the consequences of exposure, audits, lawsuits, and for some, the slow erosion of trust. Lena had no thirst for vengeance. She wanted systems rebuilt on honesty. She presided over hearings where contractors answered for their deception. She advocated for retraining rather than exile. The human cost of reform was evident, and she tended to it with small attentions. Meetings with families who had lost crops, a fund for children whose schooling had been disrupted, hands that dug beside farmers to learn another season's rhythm. Julian found that his measure as a man changed. He had once judged himself by acquisitions and by the invulnerability of his schedule. Now he judged himself by the quality of his listening, the awkwardness of his apologies, the meals he made without thinking about dinner parties. He was, in ordinary terms, more available. He learned to be small again, small enough to be bothered by a ruined stew, small enough to be asked for help tying a sneaker, small enough to let Lena take the reins on projects he once assumed were his to direct. The estate became different, not because the marble had changed, but because the sounds had. Children's footsteps in the morning, the chatter of workshops, the low, practical laughter of people who were making things, greenhouses producing seedlings for neighboring towns, a kitchen repurposed to teach community cooking classes, a library where Margaret catalogued not just books, but stories of the men and women the foundation supported. The rabbit with the button eye moved from the mantel to Lena's bedside, and later to the hands of a child whose family had been part of the rebuilt irrigation program. It was a small object, but like all such tokens, it stitched together their history. There were tender private moments that mattered more than press statements. One winter evening, Julian and Lena walked the edge of the fields, the air sharp and thin. She asked him about his old fears, the ones he had not spoken aloud, and he told her, with sudden shame and honesty, how wealthy loneliness had made him pragmatic rather than kind. She listened, and then told him about her first night at the gate, about the cold that had felt like the end of everything, and the way Margaret's hands had been warm. "You made a choice," she said simply. "You didn't have to." He understood then that what he had bought with his wealth was not redemption, and what he had earned with his attention was not perfectness. He had, in the steady currency of morning breakfasts and the occasional biolab trip, and the humble discomfort of admitting error, bought a family. As Lena matured into a leader, she took formal study in agronomy and community development, returned with practical ideas and an ethically rigorous temper. Julian's company began to shift its orientation. He appointed her to a role that married her technical skill with the authority to execute changes the philanthropic team had never been allowed to enact. Board members questioned at first. Investors watched. But the projects succeeded precisely because they were less about image and more about partnership. The farms that had once been a line item in a ledger became places of training, of co-op ownership, of women-led initiatives. The company's balance sheet altered toward sustainability because the community-based models reduced long-term risks and created resilient markets. Profits were still necessary. Without them, programs would not scale, but the calculus widened. It was economics tempered by human obligation. When Julian accepted an award at a regional civic ceremony, he stepped up to the podium with Lena beside him. Cameras flashed, but he did not look at the lights. He looked at the faces in the crowd. Farmers whose weathered hands told a history of seasons, children who had attended the foundation's new school, Margaret who sat with her knitting and felt a fierce, quiet gratitude that did not need to be performative. "Money allowed me to do many things," he said, and the sentence could have been the end of a man's justification. Instead, he continued, "But one small person taught me what to do with it." He turned and nodded toward Lena. She smiled, embarrassed, and then met his gaze with the steady look of someone who had learned responsibility through trials. The applause that followed felt less like tribute and more like recognition that human bonds are the architecture behind any worthy endeavor. The resolution felt both public and private. Julian and Lena were family. Arguably, the simple fact that had started as a Storm's charity now had the weight of years. They celebrated small holidays with neighbors who had become a kind of community, not by design, but by necessity of shared work. The estate that had once been an isolated monument was now a workshop, a field school, and sometimes a place of quiet. The board restructured to include community representation. The philanthropic arm published transparent reports with independent audits. The men and women who had cut corners were replaced by managers who understood accountability, and where possible, they were offered paths to make restitution rather than merely to be punished. In the quiet between the pages of policy and the noise of everyday recovery, Julian found himself reading children's books out loud, learning the right inflection for the grumpy ogre, sitting at small picnic tables while Lena unveiled plans for a seed bank. He learned that some questions had slow answers and some wounds needed the patience of seasons. He learned that his wealth gave him the privilege to make mistakes of generosity more than cruelty, and that the truest investments were those that paid back in human flourishing. Years later, sitting under a sky untroubled by storms, he watched Lena lead a class for local teenagers teaching basic soil science. She had a quiet authority now, one that came from knowing how to fail and how to try again. A little boy asked about the rabbit with the missing button eye, and she told the story plainly, how she had been found in the rain, and how a woman named Margaret had wrapped her in towels, and how a man who was always busy had learned to be present. She gave the rabbit to the boy for a moment, and he hugged it like a talisman, not because it was magic, but because it connected him to a lineage of care. Julian understood finally and fully that the life he thought he had salvaged by doing what was expected had been rearranged by a small, persistent human whose presence translated to responsibility and then to purpose. He had adopted Lena because he could not leave a child in the rain. He had kept her because she taught him the shape of himself worth holding. If this touched you, like and share, and tell us in the comments where you'd place your faith, in love, in money, or in both.